The unforgiving Arizona sun bleached bones and broke spirits, but it was a promise whispered in the dead of night that shattered Sarah O'Connell's world. She was the daughter of a proud rancher, a girl of 19 destined for a quiet life. Maybe a gentle marriage to a boy from town, a life of mending shirts and raising children under a wide, dusty sky. But when the shadow of ruin fell upon her family, she became a piece in a brutal game, a bride bartered to seal a fragile peace. They told her she had to marry the most feared man in the territory, the Apache warrior Cochise, a name spoken like a curse, a man whose hands were said to be permanently stained with blood, a phantom of the mountains, a killer of men. But deep within that feared warrior, behind eyes that had seen 1,000 sorrows, he hid a heart that no one, absolutely no one, knew. The dust was a living thing at the O'Connell Ranch, a fine red powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder of the failing land. It coated the tongues of the cattle, their ribs showing like fallen timber. It filmed the water in the troughs. It crept through the cracks in the walls of the small clapboard house where Sarah sat, mending one of her father's shirts for the third time. Her father, Thomas O'Connell, was a good man. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of honest work. But the drought, now choking the land for a second year, was a foe his strength could not defeat. And the real threat wasn't the sky. It was a man, Silas Kane. He was a cattle baron who had moved into the territory 3 years prior. A man with a smile as thin and cold as a razor's edge, and an ambition as vast and empty as the desert itself. He'd been choking out the smaller ranches one by one, buying up water rights, diverting streams, letting his massive herds graze on land that wasn't his. The O'Connell Ranch was the last holdout, a stubborn thorn in Kane's side. The confrontation came on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. Kane didn't arrive with lawyers. He arrived with four grim-faced riders, their hands resting casually on the butts of their colts. "O'Connell," Kane said, his voice smooth but with no warmth in it. "We've been at this a while. Your cattle are dying. Your well is nearly dry. It's time to be realistic." "This is my land, Kane," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. "My father worked it, and I'll work it till I'm in the ground." Kane let out a dry, rasping chuckle. "That can be arranged sooner than you think, but I'm here to offer a different sort of arrangement." Sarah watched from the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the desperation in her father's posture, the sag of defeat he tried so hard to hide. "There's been trouble," Kane continued, gesturing toward the distant Dragoon Mountains. "Apache trouble. Cochise and his band. They've been hitting my supply lines, running off my stock. Bad for business." The name Cochise fell like a stone in the heavy air. A legend of bloodshed whispered around campfires. They said he was more spirit than man, a warrior who had never known defeat, whose cruelty was matched only by his cunning. "What's that got to do with me?" Thomas asked. "I've been negotiating," Kane said, "through an intermediary. Cochise wants peace. He wants assurances that his lands won't be encroached upon further. He wants a treaty sealed not by paper, which his people don't trust, but by blood, by marriage." A cold dread, colder than any winter frost, snaked its way up Sarah's spine. She knew what was coming next. "He demands a wife," Kane stated flatly. "A white wife, a symbol of this new bond, a permanent hostage, if you will, to ensure the peace is kept." He paused, letting the horror sink in. "He wants a daughter from the people of this valley, and since you're the last rancher of any note standing against me, he wants yours." The world tilted. The needle slipped from Sarah's fingers, pricking her skin. Her father stood frozen, his face ashen. "No," Thomas breathed. "Absolutely not. You get off my land." Kane's voice hardened, the velvet glove stripped away. "Think about it, O'Connell. Say no, and I'll ruin you. I'll call in that loan from the bank in Tucson, the one I bought last month. I'll have the sheriff out here by week's end to evict you. You and your daughter will have nothing. Beggars on the road." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or you agree. You save your ranch. You save your legacy. You become a hero who brought peace to this valley. And I'll pay you $5,000. $5,000, a fortune. It was the price of his daughter. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped onto the porch. "Father," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "don't listen to him." Kane's eyes slid over to her, a predator's appraisal. "Ah, the lovely Sarah, a spirited girl. They say Koshise appreciates spirit." The threat hung in the air, sharp and ugly. For the rest of the day and deep into the night, the house was filled with a terrible, suffocating silence. Sarah watched her father pace, his face a mask of torment. He was trapped. Sacrifice his pride, his land, everything he'd ever worked for, or sacrifice his daughter to save it all. The next morning, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, he gave her his answer without speaking a word. He began to pack a small wooden chest for her, a few dresses, her mother's silver locket, a well-worn copy of Jane Eyre. Each item he placed inside was another nail in the coffin of her old life. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he finally whispered, his voice breaking. "I am a coward and a fool." "You are my father," she replied, her own voice strangely calm. The terror was still there, a living thing coiling in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a cold, hard resignation. She would do this for him. She would walk into the fire to save him from being burned. 2 days later, Kane's men returned. She climbed into the back of a dusty wagon, not looking back at the man who stood weeping on the porch of the home she would never see again. The journey took them east, into the harsh, rocky terrain of the mountains. The land grew wilder, more menacing, as if reflecting the turmoil in her soul. She was no longer Sarah O'Connell, daughter of a rancher. She was a tribute, a sacrifice delivered to a monster. The Chiricahua camp was not what she'd imagined. There were no demonic fires or sharpened bones. It was nestled in a hidden canyon, a collection of wickiups, domed huts of brush and hide, blending into the landscape. A clear stream trickled through the center. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. But the welcome was as hostile as any nightmare. As the wagon rolled to a stop, the entire camp seemed to freeze. Faces turned toward her, women pounding corn, old men smoking pipes, children pausing their play. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket of suspicion and contempt. These were the faces of people who had been hunted, betrayed, and killed by her kind for generations. To them, she wasn't a person. She was the enemy, delivered to their doorstep. One of Kane's men, a beefy man named Cutter, yanked her roughly from the wagon. "This is it," he grunted, shoving her forward. "Your new home." A figure detached himself from the shadows of the largest wickiup. The whispers that had begun to ripple through the crowd died instantly. Even Cutter and his men took an involuntary step back. It was Cochise. He was taller than she'd expected, lean and powerful, with a stillness that was more intimidating than any threat. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band. His face was all harsh angles and weathered lines, his skin the color of burnished copper. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were black, depthless, and they looked at her not with lust or even curiosity, but with a flat, impenetrable assessment, as if judging a horse he'd been forced to acquire. He wore simple buckskin leggings, his chest and arms bare, crisscrossed with the pale lines of old scars. He was not the savage brute of the stories. He was something far more terrifying, a man of immense, contained power. He spoke to Cutter in a low, guttural Apache dialect. Cutter, sweating profusely, gestured back at Sarah, speaking in broken, clumsy phrases. Cochise listened, his expression unchanging. Finally, he gave a curt nod. Cutter and his men practically scrambled over each other to get back to the wagon and flee, leaving Sarah standing alone in a circle of hostile eyes. Cochise turned his gaze back to her. He said a single word in English, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "Come." He turned and walked toward his wickiup, not looking back. She had no choice. Head held high, refusing to show the fear that threatened to paralyze her, she walked through the silent, staring crowd. She could feel their hatred like a physical force. One woman, her face a mask of grief and fury, spat on the ground near her feet. The inside of his lodge was larger than it looked, Spartan and clean. A fire pit sat in the center. Furs were laid out for sleeping. He gestured to a pile of furs on the opposite side of the fire from his own. A clear demarcation. Your space. My space. Then he sat, picked up a piece of wood and a knife, and began to carve, his focus absolute. He did not speak to her again. The hours passed in agonizing silence. The sun set, and the world outside the wickiup came alive with evening sounds. But inside there was only the quiet scrape of Cochise's knife on wood. Sarah sat on her furs, her hands clenched, her stomach churning with hunger and dread. This was her wedding night. She was the wife of the most feared man in the territory, and he hadn't even looked at her. Eventually, an older woman entered without permission. She had the same sharp features and intense eyes as Cochise. She carried a wooden bowl of stew and a piece of flatbread, which she placed unceremoniously on the ground in front of Sarah. "Naline," Cochise said without looking up. Naline looked at Sarah, her gaze filled with undisguised venom. She spoke in Apache, her words sharp and angry, directed at Cochise. He replied in a low monotone. Finally, Naline spat out one more phrase and stormed out. Cochise finally looked at Sarah. "She is my sister," he said, his English slow, deliberate. "Her husband was killed by soldiers. She does not welcome you." He gestured to the food. "Eat." It was a command. Sarah, despite her fear, was starving. She ate the rich stew, her eyes downcast. When she was finished, Cochise took the bowl and set it aside. He returned to his carving. She waited, her body tense, for him to cross the space between them, for him to claim the rights that had been bought and paid for by Silas Kane. She waited for the violence she had been steeling herself against for days. But he did nothing. He simply continued to carve, long into the night, a silent, brooding statue of a man. Finally, he lay down on his own furs, his back to her, and was still. Sarah lay awake for hours, listening to the alien sounds of the camp and the steady breathing of the man on the other side of the fire. She had been delivered to the monster's den, but the monster was ignoring her. It was a reprieve, but a confusing one. She was a prisoner, a wife in name only, an unwelcome ghost in the home of a man who looked at her as if she were already dead. And that silence was its own form of torment. Days bled into one another, each defined by the same suffocating routine. Sarah would wake to find Cochise already gone. She would spend the day in near total isolation. No one spoke to her. The women of the camp would walk past, their eyes sliding over her as if she were a rock or a tree. Nalin was the only one who directly acknowledged her, and only to deliver her single daily meal with a glare that could curdle milk. But Sarah's spirit was not so easily broken. She refused to cower. She began to clean the wickie up, sweeping the dirt floor with a makeshift broom of twigs, tidying the furs. It was a small act of defiance, a way of carving out a space for herself in a world that refused to see her. Cochise never commented, but she noticed he would pause for a fraction of a second when he entered, his eyes taking in the subtle changes. Her captor, her husband, remained an enigma, a man of profound silences. He moved with a quiet economy, every action precise and purposeful. She saw the respect, bordering on awe, that the other warriors gave him. Yet to her, he showed nothing. He never touched her, never raised his voice, rarely even met her gaze. He slept on his side of the fire, a chasm of unspoken tension between them. The first crack in his armor appeared 2 weeks into her captivity. A young boy in the camp had fallen ill with a fever. His mother's wails carried through the thin walls of their lodge. Late that night, unable to sleep, Sarah peered through a small gap in the hide covering. She saw Cochise walking toward the sick boy's wickiup. He wasn't carrying a weapon, but a small leather pouch. He disappeared inside. For over an hour, she watched the flickering firelight. When he emerged, the mother followed him out. Her face was streaked with tears, but she bowed her head to him in a gesture of profound gratitude. The wailing had stopped. The next day, she saw the boy playing by the stream, weak but clearly recovering. Cochise had not summoned a medicine man. He had gone himself. The feared warrior, the ruthless killer, had spent half the night personally tending to a sick child. It didn't make sense. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Cochise was gone with a hunting party. Driven by a desperate need for something to do, Sarah dared to step outside the lodge. She noticed a small flat stone near the entrance was loose. Idly, she lifted it. Beneath it was a hollowed-out space lined with soft rabbit fur. Inside was a collection of small, exquisitely detailed wooden carvings, a soaring eagle, a cunning coyote. And then she saw them. Two human figures. One was a woman, her face tilted up in a laugh, her hair intricately carved to look like it was blowing in the wind. The other was a small child, a boy holding a toy bow. They were not generic figures. They were portraits, imbued with a love so palpable it was a physical ache. This was what he carved so intently each night. Not weapons, not totems of war. Memories. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Nullen stood there, her face darker than a thundercloud. She pointed a trembling finger at the carvings in Sarah's hand. "You have no right," Nullen hissed, her voice thick with pain, a mix of Apache and broken English tumbling out in her rage. "This is not for you, not for White Eyes to see." Sarah gently placed the carvings back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean any harm." "Harm is all your people do," Nalin shot back. She pointed at the carving of the woman, his wife, my friend. Her name was Istas, snow, because her spirit was pure. She then pointed to the small boy. "And Taza, his son." Nalin's voice cracked, the fury giving way to a raw, bottomless grief. They did not die in battle. They were at a peaceful camp near the Gila River. Soldiers came. They said they were there for talks. They opened fire. On women, on children. Istas was running, Tasa in her arms. A single bullet. It took them both. The story struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. The impenetrable warrior, the cold, distant man, was a widower, a grieving father. His silence wasn't a rejection of her. It was a shrine to them. His ferocity in battle wasn't mindless savagery. It was a pain so deep it had been forged into a weapon. He wasn't empty. He was haunted. "My brother," Nellen continued, her voice now a broken whisper. "The man he was. The man who laughed, who sang the old songs. He died that day. Cochise was born in the fire that burned our family. He fights now so that no other father has to find his world turned to ash." Nalin looked at Sarah, and for the first time, her eyes held not just hatred, but a sliver of shared understanding. "He accepted this bargain with the white devil Cain to protect them," she gestured to the camp. "He suffers your presence to keep them safe. Do not mistake his silence for peace. He is at war, even when he sits by the fire." Nalin turned and walked away, leaving Sarah reeling. She looked at the simple wickiup, her prison, and saw it now as a mausoleum of one man's heart. She understood now why he couldn't look at her, why he couldn't touch her. To do so would be to betray the memory of the woman and child he carved from wood, desperately trying to keep their ghosts alive in his hands. He hadn't forced her here for his own desire, but as a shield for his people. And in that moment, her fear of Cochise the monster transformed into a profound, aching sorrow for Cochise the man. The fragile, unspoken truce that had settled over the wickiup was shattered by the arrival of two Apache scouts. They rode into camp at a gallop, their horses lathered and their faces grim, bypassing all others to go straight to Cochise. Sarah watched from the doorway as a tense conference took place. Cochise's body language shifted from its usual calm stillness to a coiled, dangerous energy. A cold dread settled in her stomach. This was not the posture of peace. Later that evening, Cochise entered the lodge. The air around him crackled with a barely suppressed fury. He didn't sit down to carve. He paced the small space like a caged panther. "Your white chief," he finally said, the words bitten off, "is a liar." Sarah's breath caught. "Silas Kane. What has he done?" "The treaty, this marriage." Cochise gestured dismissively at her, the first time he had ever directly acknowledged their situation. "It was a lie, a trick to make us quiet, to lower our guard." He stopped pacing and stared at her, his black eyes boring into her soul. "His men do not stay in the valley. They move through the canyons. They mark the water holes. They count our warriors. They scout our defenses. They are not preparing for peace. They are preparing for an attack." The world swam before Sarah's eyes. Her sacrifice, her father's impossible choice, her own suffering. It had all been for nothing, worse than nothing. It had been a weapon used against these people. She was not a peace offering. She was the bait in a trap, a Trojan horse made of flesh and blood. I, I didn't know, she stammered. I swear to you. My father believed him. He thought he was saving our ranch. He saved his land with his daughter's life, Cochise said, his voice flat and devoid of pity. And he handed her to his enemy to be used as a blindfold while he sharpened his knife. The shame was a physical burn. Cain hadn't just betrayed the Apache. He had betrayed her. The $5,000 hadn't been a payment. It had been a bribe to buy her father's complicity in a monstrous deception. Suddenly, Koshise's anger seemed to shift. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his expression softened for a barest fraction of a second. He wasn't seeing the white woman, the enemy. He was seeing a pawn, just as his own people had been pawns in the white man's games for generations. "What is this Tucson?" he asked abruptly. The scouts heard Cain's men speak of it, a shipment from Tucson. Sarah's mind struggled to catch up. Tucson is a city to the south. It's where the railroad comes through. The army has a fort there. Kokoshi's eyes narrowed. Railroad? Yes, she said, her mind racing. They bring supplies, tools, food, weapons. The word hung in the air between them. Gatling gun, Koshi said, the English words sounding alien on his tongue. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. A Gatling gun, the devastating rapid-fire weapon that had turned the tide in so many battles against the tribes. It wasn't a weapon for defense. It was a weapon of annihilation. Cain wasn't planning to push the Chiricahua back. He was planning to wipe them out. He means to slaughter you all, she whispered, the horror of it stealing her breath. While you are honoring a treaty, he's planning a massacre. In that moment, everything changed. She was no longer just a captive. Her fate was now inextricably bound to that of the people who held her. If Cain attacked, his men would not differentiate between an Apache woman and the white woman in their leader's lodge. She would die with them. More than that, a profound and unexpected sense of justice rose up in her. Cain had used her, made her an unwitting part of his evil. The debt was no longer hers to pay to her father. It was Silas Cain's to pay to her. The main trail from Tucson is predictable, she found herself saying, her voice gaining strength. It comes up through Apache Pass. It's the only route wide enough for a heavy wagon, the kind needed to transport a Gatling gun. Cochise watched her, his expression unreadable, but intensely focused. He was listening. But there are other ways, she continued, picturing the maps she had studied with her father. Old mining trails, harder to traverse, but less guarded. He would expect you to watch the main pass. He might try to bring it through the foothills to the west, through what the settlers call Skeleton Canyon. He walked over to the dirt floor and, using the tip of his knife, began to sketch a crude map of the mountains as he knew them. He pointed to a spot. Here? Sarah knelt opposite him, the firelight casting their shadows long against the walls. For the first time, they were not captor and captive, man and woman, Apache and white. They were two strategists united against a common, treacherous foe. Yes, she said, using her finger to trace a line in the dirt. Exactly there. It's a longer route, but if he wants the element of surprise, that is where he will go. Cochise stared at the map in the dirt. Then his gaze lifted to meet hers. The abyss of silence and grief that had separated them was suddenly bridged by a shared purpose. He saw not a symbol of his oppression, but a source of unexpected knowledge. And she saw not a fearsome warrior, but a leader desperate to save his people from a serpent's poison. You will show me on a better map, he commanded, though the harshness was gone from his tone. You will tell me everything you know about this gun, how it works, how many men it needs. I will, she promised, her voice steady. The war with Silas Cain had begun, and Sarah O'Connell, the girl sold to bring a false peace, had just become his most dangerous enemy. The camp transformed overnight. The lazy rhythm of daily life was replaced by the urgent hum of preparation for war. Warriors cleaned rifles and fletched arrows. And at the center of it all, in Cochise's wiki-up, an unlikely alliance was being forged. Using charcoal on a stretched piece of deerskin, Sarah drew every map she could remember, detailing the trails, canyons, and water sources between their stronghold and Tucson. Cochise would watch, his keen eyes absorbing every detail, occasionally asking a sharp question in his halting English. He would then summon his senior warriors and, using her map, translate her knowledge into a language of ambush points and strategic retreats they understood. She was no longer invisible. The warriors who had once ignored her now nodded in grudging respect as she passed. Even Nalan's hostility began to thaw. One afternoon, Sarah saw Cochise's sister struggling to grind medicinal herbs, her arm clearly aching from an old injury. Without a word, Sarah took the heavy stone pestle from her and began to work, using the steady rhythmic motion her own mother had taught her for grinding corn. Nalan watched for a long moment, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. The next day when she brought Sarah's food, she also brought a small comb carved from bone. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a truce. The most profound change, however, was between Sarah and Cochise. The nights were still spent on opposite sides of the fire, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared understanding. He started talking to her, not just about strategy, but about his people. He told her the Chiricahua name for the mountains she called the Dragoons, standing upright, and explained the stories of the spirits that lived among the peaks. In return, she told him about her world. She described the ocean, a body of water so vast it met the sky, a concept he struggled to grasp. She told him the story of Jane Eyre, of a woman who followed her heart against all odds. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his eyes fixed on the fire, as if seeing the story in the flames. One evening, he was examining a new rifle one of his scouts had acquired, a Winchester repeater, a fine weapon, but it had jammed. He worked at it, his frustration growing. "The metal tooth does not cat," he said, holding it out. Sarah hesitated, then took the heavy weapon. She had watched her father strip and clean his own rifle 100 times. With careful fingers, she worked the lever, feeling for the sticking point. "There's a burr on the extractor," she said. "It needs to be filed down. Do you have a small metal file?" He stared at her, a flicker of astonishment in his eyes. He produced a small worn file from a leather pouch. For the next half hour they worked together, she pointing out the microscopic piece of flawed metal, he's using his steady, powerful hands to carefully file it smooth. When they were done, she reassembled the mechanism and worked the lever. It moved with a satisfying, clean click-clack. He took the rifle from her, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that seemed to travel straight to her heart. It was the first time they had made physical contact. He looked from the rifle to her, and his mask of stoic leadership slipped, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath. "You are not like the other white women," he said, the admission seeming to cost him something. "And you are not the monster they say you are," she replied softly. A deep sadness crossed his features. "The man I was is buried with my wife and son. What is left is what my people need me to be." "They need a leader," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "But even a leader can allow his heart to heal." He looked at the intricate carvings of Istas and Taza that he had placed on a ledge inside the wickiup, no longer hidden away. His gaze was filled with a sorrow so profound it made her own chest ache in sympathy. He was a man trapped between memory and necessity, between a past he could not release and a future that demanded everything from him. That night, as she lay on her furs, Sarah realized with a startling jolt that her feelings had shifted completely. The fear was long gone, replaced by respect, then by a deep, compassionate empathy. Now watching him across the fire as he finally slept, a man bearing the weight of a people on his shoulders, she felt something else bloom in the barren landscape of her heart. It was a tender, terrifying, and utterly impossible feeling. She was falling in love with her captor. She was falling in love with Cochise, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that a heart so devoted to the dead might never have room for the living. The day the lookouts signaled a dust cloud rising from Skeleton Canyon, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. Her information had been correct. Kane's trap was coming, but now Cochise had a counter trap of his own. The battle for their survival was about to begin, and with it, the battle for a future she hadn't even known she wanted. Skeleton Canyon was a jagged scar in the earth, a place of ambush and bad memory. It was here that Cochise chose to make his stand. The warriors, maybe 40 in all, moved like ghosts through the scrub and boulders, taking positions on the high ridges overlooking the narrow trail. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had the land as their ally. Cochise had insisted that Sarah remain at a secure camp miles back, but she had argued. "I am not a warrior," she had told him, "but I am not helpless. My mother was a healer. I know how to set bones and stitch wounds. Let me come. Let me be of use." He had studied her face, a conflict raging in his dark eyes. To bring her near the battle was a risk, but to deny his people her skills was a greater one. He finally gave a single, sharp nod. Now, in a sheltered rock alcove, Sarah worked with Nalan and three other women, laying out clean cloths and grinding herbs. The animosity between her and Cochise's sister had evaporated, replaced by a focused, shared purpose. The first sound was the rumble of the heavy wagon, then came the shouts of the drivers. Sarah crept to the edge of the alcove and peered down. Silas Kane himself was there, riding a fine black stallion alongside the wagon. He was flanked by at least 60 men, a private army of hired guns. The wagon was covered in canvas, hiding the deadly machine within. They moved with a swaggering confidence, utterly oblivious to the eyes watching them from above. The world exploded in a coordinated storm of violence. The first volley of arrows and rifle fire came from both sides of the canyon at once. Men screamed and fell. Horses reared. Kane's men, caught completely by surprise, scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the rocks. From his vantage point, Cochise directed the battle with hand signals, a conductor of chaos. His warriors were masters of this kind of fighting, appearing to fire a volley, then melting back into the rocks, only to reappear in a different spot. But Kane's men were veterans. They rallied, using the wagon and dead horses for cover, and began to lay down a withering field of fire. The first wounded were brought back to the alcove. A young warrior, no older than 16, was carried in, a bullet wound high in his chest, his breathing a ragged, bubbling gasp. Sarah's training took over, her fear pushed aside by a wave of cold focus. "Lay him here," she commanded. For the next hour, the alcove became a place of controlled horror. Sarah stitched, cleaned, and bandaged, her hands and dress soon stained with blood. Down in the canyon, the battle reached a fever pitch. Kane, enraged, screamed at his men to tear the canvas from the wagon. They finally dragged the Gatling gun into position. Its bronze barrels gleamed menacingly. The moment it began to fire, the sound was a terrifying, continuous roar. A mechanical demon spitting death. It shredded the rock faces, sending chips of granite flying like shrapnel. The Apache fire faltered under the onslaught. This was the weapon that could annihilate them all. Sarah watched in horror as the gunner traversed the weapon towards Cochise's position. But before he could fire, a single warrior rose from a seemingly impossible hiding place on the opposite ridge. It was Chitao, a warrior who had once been openly hostile to Sarah. With a final, defiant war cry, he hurled himself from the rocks, a lit bundle of pitch-soaked rags in his hand. He was riddled with bullets before he had fallen 10 feet. But his trajectory was true. The primitive bomb landed squarely in the ammunition crates beside the Gatling gun. The explosion was immense. The wagon, the gun, and the men around it were consumed in a ball of fire and black smoke. The canyon fell silent for a stunned second, the roar of the gun replaced by the ringing in their ears. That was the turning point. With their ultimate weapon destroyed, panic set in among Kane's men. Cochise seized the moment, letting out a piercing cry that was answered by his warriors as they surged from the rocks, closing in for the final fight. The battle devolved into brutal, hand-to-hand skirmishes. Sarah saw Cochise, a whirlwind of deadly motion, fighting his way toward the center of the chaos. He was heading for one man, Silas Kane. Kane, his face pale with terror, fired his pistol wildly. Cochise moved like smoke, knocking the gun from Kane's hand and pulling the cattle baron from his horse. They fell to the ground in a tangle of limbs. It ended when Cochise rose, his knife dripping red. Silas Kane lay still in the dust. Seeing their leader fall, the last of his men broke and fled. Slowly, an eerie quiet descended upon Skeleton Canyon, broken only by the groans of the wounded. The battle was over. They had won. But the cost was staggering. Chitao and 6 other warriors were dead. As Sarah moved among the wounded, offering what comfort she could, she saw Cochise walking through the carnage. He was not celebrating. His face was a grim mask, counting the price of his people's survival. His eyes found hers across the blood-soaked ground. He was wounded, a long gash on his arm bleeding freely. He started walking towards her, his gaze locked with hers. In that moment, surrounded by death and victory, she knew that nothing could ever be the same again. The bargain had been broken, the serpent beheaded. Their two worlds had crashed together in this canyon, and what would rise from the wreckage was a terrifying and unknown future. The days that followed were somber. Victory had been won, but the camp was in mourning. The smoke from the funeral pyres of the 7 fallen warriors, including the redeemed Chatao, hung in the valley for 2 days. Sarah worked tirelessly alongside Nalan, tending to the wounded. She moved through the camp not as an outsider, but as one of their own. The women would offer her small smiles. The children no longer ran from her. She had earned her place. Cochise was recovering from the gash on his arm, which Sarah had cleaned and stitched herself. The intimacy of the act had been a silent testament to how far they had come. He had sat stoically while she worked, his eyes never leaving her face. About a week after the battle, a lone rider was spotted approaching the camp. It was not an enemy, it was her father. Word of the battle had spread, twisted into a tale of a brutal Apache massacre. But Thomas, his heart sick with guilt, had ridden out to learn the truth. He found the wreckage in the canyon and knew Cain's treachery had been exposed. He had come to beg for his daughter's life, to take her home. The reunion was strained. They met by the stream, away from the prying eyes of the camp. "Sarah," Thomas began, his voice choked with emotion. He looked older, more frail. "I came to get you. It's over. Cain is dead. The deal is void. You can come home." Sarah looked at her father, at the familiar lines of his face, and felt a surge of love, but also a strange sense of distance. The word home sounded foreign. The small clapboard house, the dusty yard. It felt like a lifetime ago, a life that belonged to a different person. "He lied to you, father," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "He used us. He used me to blind these people so he could murder them all." "I know," he wept, his shoulders shaking. "I know that now. I was a fool. I failed you, Sarah. Let me make it right. Come home. Leave this place." He gestured around at the rugged mountains at the Wickiups. "This isn't your life. These are not your people." But as he said the words, Sarah knew he was wrong. She looked at the faces of the women she had healed, the children who now smiled at her, the majestic peaks that Koshise had taught her the names of. She thought of the silence in the Wickiup, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a shared, comfortable presence. She thought of Koshis, the grieving widower, the brilliant leader, the man who had slowly, cautiously begun to let her see the heart he kept so carefully hidden. "My place is here now," she said softly. The words felt truer than anything she had ever spoken. Her father stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and heartbreak. "With him? A savage? Sarah, you can't mean this." "He is not a savage," she corrected him, a fierce protectiveness rising in her. "He is a man of honor who has suffered more than you can ever imagine. And he is the man I love." The confession, spoken aloud for the first time, solidified in her heart, turning from a fragile feeling into an unbreakable truth. Thomas O'Connell pleaded with her, but he saw the resolve in her gray eyes, the same stubborn strength her mother had possessed. He finally accepted the devastating truth. He had lost his daughter, not to a forced marriage, but to a love he could never have foreseen. He mounted his horse, a broken man, and rode away. That evening, when Cochise returned to the lodge, he found Sarah waiting by the fire. "Your father is gone," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "He asked me to go with him." Cochise stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. This was the moment of truth for him, too. "And what did you tell him?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I told him I was already home." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if absorbing the weight of her words. When he opened them, the last of his defenses had fallen away. The haunted, guarded look was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. He slowly crossed the space between them, closing the gap that had separated them for so long. He knelt before her and took her hands in his. His were calloused and strong. Hers were smaller but no less steady. "Sarah," he said, speaking her name with a reverence she had never heard before. "My heart has been a land of ghosts for a very long time. I did not think the sun could ever reach it again." He looked into her eyes and she saw everything he had kept hidden. The pain, the sorrow, but also a burgeoning hope, as fragile and beautiful as a desert flower after a rain. "You are the sun," he whispered. He did not need to say more. In the quiet glow of the fire, in the lodge that had once been her prison and was now her sanctuary, he leaned forward and gently kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound gratitude, of two broken souls finding solace, of a promise of a new beginning, built from the ashes of the old. She was no longer Sarah O'Connell, the bartered bride. He was no longer just Cochise, the feared warrior. They were simply a man and a woman who had found in each other a home, a heart, and a future written not in the dust of a cruel bargain, but in the enduring language of love and survival. The story of Sarah O'Connell and the Apache warrior Cochise is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a powerful testament to the human spirit's ability to find love in the most desolate of places and courage in the face of impossible odds. Theirs is a journey from captivity to connection, from a bargain forged in betrayal to a bond sealed by mutual respect and a love that defied every boundary. It reminds us that behind the fearsome legends and hardened faces of history are real people, with hearts that can be broken and, with enough strength and understanding, can be healed again. If this story of a love that bridged two worlds and a courage that rewrote destiny has captured your imagination, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story with real heart. And most importantly, subscribe for more unforgettable tales from the forgotten corners of the American West. Thank you for listening.